Welcome, everybody. We thought, since it's early on a Sunday morning, we would ease you into the program with something a little lighthearted, the global refugee crisis. According to the UN, right now, there are more refugees in the world than at any time since record-keeping began. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But the biggest one is the civil war in Syria, which has been going on for close to 5 years now. And so we have a couple experts in different parts of that story. To my immediate right, Mark Schnellbaecher is in charge of Syria for the International Rescue Committee. He is based in Amman, Jordan, and actually just flew in from Amman. So if he drifts off, I'll throw some water on you. But he has really firsthand on-the-ground experience from the region where people are leaving Syria, really at the front lines. And then, of course, you all know Eleanor Beardsley. Though you may not recognize her face, you know her voice. She's our correspondent based in Paris and has traveled really all over Europe covering this refugee crisis as it has spilled into Europe, just changing the landscape of the continent in ways that we have already seen and ways that we're just now beginning to understand that may reshape Europe, honestly, for generations. And so we'll get into that as well. And as Howard mentioned, before I returned from London, I was an international correspondent and also had a hand in covering some of these stories from various parts of Europe and the surrounding areas. So I thought before we get into the discussion, one of the things that I really want us all to appreciate is the global scope of this problem. And partly because it is such a global problem, it's a problem that NPR is uniquely situated to cover. We have more international bureaus than virtually any American news organization. And so that means we can really cover this story from everywhere that it's happening, from the Middle East to every corner of Europe. And many of our international correspondents have been part of this effort. We're going to begin with a bit of a listening session where we've pulled 6 short clips from different stories that we've done in different countries. Although we've had many correspondents involved in the effort, these are just stories that Eleanor and I have done. And so we're going to begin with Bodrum, Turkey, which is this beautiful, picturesque beach town that also has the dubious distinction of being the closest point between Turkey and Greece. And so when migrants, refugees, asylum seekers are trying to make their way to Europe by sea, this is one of the most popular departure points. So just a couple of months ago, I was in Bodrum, Turkey, interviewing a lot of Syrians who were trying to make their way across the water. And then I met one of the small-time human smugglers who is taking them on these journeys. So let's listen to just a short clip of that conversation. Let's see. Oops, no? Here we go. Oh.
The smuggling rings here are organized by the Turkish mafia. Noman says he operates on fringes. If people can't afford the big-time smugglers, they'll get them to Greece on the cheap. Is it safe?
No safe, but there is problem in Pakistan, Syria, there is die, and there is a die.
He's saying you could die from war in your home country, or you could die at sea with the chance of reaching someplace better.
Yes, but there are boats for 4 people that have 10 people at a time.
I know, but they don't have money for big boats. Understand? If he gave a lot of money, then I purchase big boats. Big boat is very expensive.
In case you couldn't hear that last cut, he said, I know, but they don't have money for a big boat. Understand? If you give a lot of money, then I purchase a big boat. Big boat is very expensive. And of course, we all know there have been so many horrific stories of people sinking on these tiny overcrowded rafts that have crossed over to Greece. So people then make their way to generally Greece. Our colleague Joanna Kakissis has done incredible coverage in Greece. And we're going to pick up the story now in Austria, where Eleanor reported on the impact that tens of thousands of people arriving unannounced have had on one small Austrian town.
The small town of Teiskirchen, population 20,000, has leafy, tree-lined sidewalks and brightly painted houses. It's the kind of place where neighbors stop and speak to each other. Today, Teiskirchen is overwhelmed with refugees. Andreas Papler is mayor.
We try our best. We try it in a holistic way. That's my philosophy, that there are people coming here, they are fleeing, they have no existence in their country, so we have to give them a little bit of welcome culture, but it's difficult.
Syrian is no stranger to refugees. Waves of asylum seekers have been housed in a facility here since Hungarians fled Soviet tanks in 1956. Butler reels off the different nationalities taken in over the years.
1968 people from Czechoslovakia, we had 1973 people from Chile, we had Uganda.
But the mayor says the town has never known anything like the numbers arriving today.
We hear a lot about the crossing over sea. A less reported part of this story is that people are also crossing into Europe by land. Earlier this year, I traveled to Bulgaria, which shares a land border with Turkey, and reported on people making the illegal crossing there. And I met a border guard who, through a translator, told me about, he was a small-town police officer who, with little or no training, was, at the moment Bulgaria realized all of these thousands of people were sneaking into Bulgaria, he was sent to keep them out. And he told me, through a translator, as you'll hear, that they were given almost no preparation or training for this.
They look like nomads. They have been on the road a long time, considered also poor and dirty.
We're not using his name because he could get fired for talking to us. He says he had no training or preparation as a border guard.
We were given orders not to fire our weapons at any cost. And we were also given orders not to let anybody in at any cost.
How do you do both of those things at the same time?
I had no idea.
He says the migrants who showed up during the day looked old, tired, sick, hungry. The ones who showed up at night were stronger and healthier. He would shout at them in Bulgarian and English.
Stop, don't cross the border, turn around, go back to Turkey.
Many of them did not understand the language. Sometimes they would run at the guards, and sometimes the guards used their batons.
They beat people once or twice a day.
So we've now heard from a smuggler, a mayor, a border guard. Let's hear from one of the actual refugees. This is an excerpt from one of Eleanor's stories from Hungary.
But keep them they did all day under a scorching sun. Journalists were not allowed to go near the train and watch from the station platform. The migrants held handwritten signs out the windows that said, "We want to go to Germany," and chanted, "No camp." At one point, a desperate man got off the train holding his tiny daughter in his arms. A Hungarian healthcare worker checked her swollen eyes. Abdel-Munan, who's from Iraq, says his daughter was afflicted with whatever she has after 2 days in a Hungarian refugee camp, and he'd rather die than go back.
Please, that's my baby. Kill me.
In Beachville, the standoff with the migrant train continued into the night. Locals came out to watch. 30-year-old Alex Olaf grew up here. He says the whole train scene is reminiscent of another era when people were herded onto trains and not told where they were going.
I can tell you this is like a long time ago in the Second World War. When I ordered them to train, you go to work. You go to work. And they don't go to work, they have to die, And then, a little bit similar, we go to Germany and we don't go to Germany, we go to care. It's not correct.
Provocative comparison there. And while, as I said, Syria and the civil war there are the largest driver of the refugee crisis, it's not the only driver. There are also refugees from other parts of the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, and North Africa. I visited a camp in northern Paris, in Calais, which is the closest crossing point to England, where people are trying to get across the English Channel to the UK. And this camp is called the Jungle. And it's not like what you imagine a refugee camp to be. It is rough and tumble. It is makeshift, sheets and tarps and plywood lean-tos where people have been living for months trying to get to the UK. And these are some of the people I met at that camp who were not from Syria.
The jungle vibrates with activity. People build and cook, wash clothes, and kick soccer balls. Ara is from Sudan. Like many migrants, he's afraid to give his last name. He's hammering together long plans.
This is my new house. Actually, it's not mine. It is for my friend. This is Syrian guys. They are Syrian. They have no home. And I'm helping to set up a new home for business.
The oldest of the group
broke his leg 2 days ago trying to hop on a train in the UK. Arn says these Eritreans are all underage.
They're all teenagers.
There is a leader.
So you're the leader.
Yeah, I'm the leader.
Did you come here alone?
I upload this.
When did you come here?
4 months ago.
And now you understand the ways of the campus. So you new people?
Yeah, I was there.
Jungles are famously Darwinian places, and it's true that at the jungle campsite here in Calais there has been violence. If you leave your shoes out, they may get stolen. But it's impossible to miss the people here with almost nothing caring for those who have even less.
So we're going to end with a project that I really think shows NPR's reach and commitment to the story. And this is the story of a man who I met in Turkey and did a pretty lengthy story about. His name was Monzer Omar. And when he crossed from Turkey to Greece, we had him make recordings of his crossing. When he got to Greece, our colleague Joanna Kakissis met with him, did a couple of stories about his journey through Greece and Macedonia. We continued to follow him through Serbia and Hungary, and finally, Eleanor met up with Monzer Omar for the last stage of his journey in Germany.
Though his English isn't perfect, Omar speaks easily and talks openly about his feelings. He says in Germany he no longer has to worry about getting enough to eat or where to sleep, but he wakes each day to new worries.
We hope to listen good news about us, what will happen. Maybe today will take us to make an interview with us, to record our names, to doing our papers, official papers.
He's anxious to complete his residency paperwork and begin his new life. But every day there's nothing, says Omar, only breakfast, lunch, and dinner. His wife is expecting another child in 5 months, and they were hoping it would be born here in Germany. But he doubts it now because everything seems to take so long.
We heard earlier in that story that his wife and daughter are still in Syria, and he was traveling alone hoping to send for them. So, with that as context, let's dive into the conversation, and we're going to be eager to take your questions at the end of this. But to start, Mark, can you just walk us through the numbers? Give us the overall picture of, since your expertise is Syria, how many people are displaced within the country, outside of the country? How big is this problem?
The pre-war population of Syria is about 22 million. The latest estimate from some interpolations that were done last month, it's about 17.1. So there's more than 4.1 million Syrians in the 4 surrounding countries. There's about 7 million displaced within the country.
Okay, so if I could probably, 7 million Syrians displaced within the country, about 4 million in the immediate surrounding countries, that's Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq.
So half the population of Syria, pre-war population, is now displaced in one fashion or another.
And of those, Eleanor, do we have an estimate for how many have arrived in Europe so far?
This year, they're saying 700,000, but there are estimates that as many as 7 million could be coming.
Over the years to come?
Yes, and there shows no sign of abating.
Because those numbers are so big, could you each tell us the story of one person you have met who sticks with you and will stay in your memory?
You know, Ari, there's been so many people. I'll just very briefly tell you two. I remember a moment, I mean, we've all heard about their families and the hardships of the crossing in the sea, and that's horrible. But one person I met just sort of struck me of how precarious the journey is. You're just at the whims and mercy of you don't know who the whole time. You don't know who to trust. It was going from, they had finally put the trains back on from Budapest, you know, where everyone was camping out and they wouldn't let them leave, to go to Austria. And the people were so happy. And I was in a train car of young men, mostly from Mosul in Iraq. And they, of course, the town's been taken over by ISIS. And there was a young father and his wife, and it was obviously a well-off person. He was holding his little child with a baby Bjorn, and he was so happy to be on that train. And then we were all there. He didn't speak English, but then came the realization that the ticket cost 39 euros from Budapest to Vienna. Then came his realization that he had paid 300 euros each. So he had paid 900 euros, almost all of his savings, just to take the train to Vienna. And we didn't know what to say. And I said, why? Through one of his friends, why did you do that? He said, because I didn't speak Hungarian. And so a Hungarian man bought my ticket. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that's just tragic, you know? And but there was nothing he could do about it. And just a contrast to that, you know, you hear about the Hungarians and how difficult it's been. But there were so many Hungarians that were horrified by this sort of treatment, and I actually spent the morning with the former Prime Minister of Hungary, and every night, he and his wife, they moved their own baby into their bedroom to free up some rooms, and they have Syrian families come every night to spend what he calls one normal night, and they let the kids watch TV, and he was cooking them breakfast. He's actually also, he wrote a cookbook, and he was making lentils to try to, and so that was an incredible two contrasts of how that journey can be for these people.
In a minute, I want to get more deeply into the question of how different European countries have responded, but before we do, Mark, is there somebody you've met whose story really stays in your mind?
Yeah, I think it would be one of my Syrian colleagues who works for us in Hasake, which is the Kurdish-controlled area in northeast Syria. He's been detained on our watch 4 times by different militant groups doing work for us. And one time quite brutally. He still does it. He has relatives in all of the refuge countries around and relatives in Norway, but continues back. So it's certainly true that many Syrians want to leave, but there's still a lot of Syrians who want to stay in their country and are making great sacrifices to do so.
I think the person who sticks in my mind of the many who I would mention, partly he sticks in my mind because he keeps texting me. When I was in Turkey, I exchanged contact information with a lot of people because they didn't know what day they would be leaving and what was going to happen. There was a lot of uncertainty. And so we would exchange phone numbers and we would text to keep up with each other. And so this was somebody who I met early one morning who the night before had been told, we're leaving now. And he was put on an overcrowded raft. And shortly after they started the journey to Greece, the raft sank, as happens to a lot of people. They were very fortunate that they were still close to shore. He had a life preserver, but he was so traumatized by the experience that when I met him the following morning, he said, I've decided to go back to Syria. He said, better to die in a war than to drown at sea. So then he returned to Syria, and he said, this is now via text message, there's no life for me here, there's no future for me here, my life is over. So he's now returned to Turkey, and he's working in a factory trying to get enough money to pay a smuggler again to try to make the journey again. And you just think about the degree of desperation required to first make the choice to return to the war, and then make the choice, having returned to the war, to try to make this journey again that was so traumatic the first time. Which brings me to a question I would like you both to try to answer. Why now? The Syrian civil war has been going on for close to 5 years. Why this year did we suddenly see this refugee crisis explode?
Well, that was a question, Ari, I asked almost every Syrian I met because I was wondering that myself, and I heard many different answers, but you would see a lot of young men and their options had run out. They were in university, and now they were going to have to go in Assad's army. And they said there were no other options but to leave because they could not fight their fellow Syrians. And they said there were these checkpoints, just even getting out of Syria. If you were even if your ID card said you were from Aleppo, they could shoot you on the spot if they wanted to, because that was a known town, to have broken away from Assad. So there was that reason, young men fleeing military service. And then many people said, we managed to stay out of the war for a few years, but now our house has been destroyed and it was impossible, that everything was gone. And many people described a triangle, ISIS, al-Nusra, and the army of Bashar al-Assad. They said, you're just constantly living in fear of the three. I'd say, who is worse, ISIS or Assad? And they'd say, it's two sides of the same coin. You cannot live like that. You're just going back and forth. They just each have their own methods of killing, but they're all killing.
Although it was interesting to me, in a story you did recently, you found people in Europe fighting over, one man who had identified with the rebels, another man who had identified with the government. Each, now that they were in Europe, is saying, your guys are responsible for the situation we're in.
Our colleague Lauren Freyer.
Oh, that was Lauren, I'm sorry.
It was very interesting since the Russian bombing, so I was fascinated to hear that as well. Because I didn't meet any pro-Assad people on my journeys, but yeah, she obviously did. So.
Mark, why do you think this is happening now?
A lot of Syrians, Syria was a middle-class country before. It wasn't, a developing country. A lot of people left with everything they own. They sold everything and they brought their stuff with them. They've been pauperized over the last 4 years. They burned through whatever resources they had. All the countries around them where they live now do not allow them to work, so they have no means of replenishing their resources. The international humanitarian response is falling woefully short. This year it's only 45% funded.
Only 45% funded?
Yeah. And people just see no hope in the surrounding countries. They see no hope back in Syria. They see absolutely no political process trying to solve the problem in Syria. So you put all of this stuff together, people just, what do we got to lose? We might as well try our fates in Europe.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the international humanitarian response, because I just returned from a reporting trip to Toledo, Ohio. After covering the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe, I thought it would be interesting to look at Syrian refugees who've come to the United States. And the US has taken in fewer than 2,000 refugees from Syria, compared to hundreds of thousands in Europe, millions in the neighboring countries. And so after I went to Toledo and spoke with some of the refugee families who are all, of course, thrilled to be in the United States, I interviewed the State Department official in charge of refugee issues, Ann Richard. And I said, is the US a leader on this? And she said, well, we're a leader globally taking in refugees, and we are a leader in providing assistance to Syrians in the surrounding camps in the neighboring countries. But for various reasons, we're not taking in a lot of refugees. And then she went on to explain that. So my question to you, Mark, is do you see that leadership that Ann describes in the camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey? Is the US doing what needs to be done? Are other countries doing what needs to be done?
Well, the US is the largest funder of the refugee response. It's $1.2 billion this year, which is about a third of the entire international response for both inside Syria and in the surrounding countries. So in that sense, yeah, Ms. Richards is correct. The US is leading the way, followed by the European Union and then some of the European countries themselves. But our whole response seems to be premised on the idea that Syrian civilian suffering is inexhaustible, that they will put up with anything, and the political process will mosey along as it will, and people will put up with anything. And I think this summer is showing that people do have a limit, and that we have reached it for many of them. And I'm not sure how we put that back in the bottle.
Mark talks about the European Union response in terms of the international humanitarian crisis. Is there such thing as a European response to the flood of refugees that is showing up in Europe?
Not really, Ari. What's amazing, we've all heard this is the worst crisis that Europe's faced since World War II. But what's also amazing is that Europe was completely blindsided by this crisis. So everything they're doing now is late, last minute, emergency, and it's not working. And another thing that's very interesting is it is dividing old Europe and new Europe. So you have, Germany and France and Italy who are trying to create a system of sharing the burden, taking refugees from other countries, and the younger countries, part of the EU, Poland, Slovakia, who say, no, Hungary, we're not going to do it. And you look at some of these countries like Hungary, they've virtually had no migration. This is just a pure Hungarian country. People there, 95% of people have never even met a migrant. And yet their government is turning it, them against these migrants before they even meet them. There are no Muslims. So, in France, there's a huge Muslim population, and in Germany too, in these old Europe countries. In the young Europe countries, there's none. So they have these Christian roots. They feel under assault. They've never had migrants coming, immigration. So they've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people coming through their countries. And right now, Europe it seems to be grasping at straws and trying to get on board with the same thing. They're trying various solutions, but there isn't one. And this is, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, said this will fundamentally alter our country, and it will. You feel it. I mean, I'm in France, which is kind of untouched by it. France is trying to help Germany, but even there you feel it. Every day there seems to be a new initiative, and someone is opting out, and someone doesn't want to do this, so it's dividing Europe. It's calling into question its open border policies. You've got some countries building fences, the migrants rerouting. The only thing that's sure, Ari, is that they are still coming. And I spoke with my colleague, Joanna Kakissis, just yesterday. She said she stood on a beach in Lesbos, and in 1 hour, 10 boats came in, 1 hour.
And this is after the weather has started getting colder, seas are getting choppier.
In the month of October, she said, 1/3 of all the migrants that had arrived on that island arrived in October, and it's getting colder, and they're not stopping.
Everybody thought it would decrease as the fall set in. I should say one notable exception to the old New Europe divide is the UK, where I lived for nearly 2 years, which has basically said, not our problem. In fact, we're not sure if we want to be in Europe. We're going to have a referendum on it in the next couple of years, which they can do because they're an island, and they've always been in this sort of tug of war between Europe and the United States, not wanting to be entirely in bed with one or the other, but wanting to have the option of
But
both.
they've agreed to take 20,000 Syrians over the next 5 years.
And 20,000 over 5 years.
That's as many as Munich takes in a weekend. And if we've got a multicultural country like the UK unwilling to take it, it's not a big surprise that Slovakia, which is all Slovak, and the same situation as Hungary, doesn't want any. So it's a big problem.
Do you feel that there's a unified regional response with Syria's neighboring countries, or if not unified, at least organized and coherent, less slapdash than in Europe?
No. They for a couple of years, I think were very, very generous, and in the last year, it has become very, very difficult for refugees. Borders are closing. Refugees who are allowed into Lebanon now, or those who wish to renew their refugee registration, are asked to sign a pledge that they will not work. So it's basically saying, I will be a pauper.
What's been incredible to me meeting so many people is we think of refugees as tired, hungry, desperate, poor, which many of them are, but they have come from lives that, as you say, were entirely middle class. A professor who worked at the state-run university that because it was state-run, the rebels saw everybody associated with the university as enemies. We're meeting doctors and lawyers and people who had what we would think of as entirely normal lives, whose lives are turned on their heads. And they try to create a new life for themselves in Turkey or the Emirates or places where they find, even if they have the skills, even if they have the language, they're not allowed to work and they're not allowed to earn money. Long-term, Eleanor, how do you see this reshaping Europe? I mean, one of the things that strikes me is walls going up between countries that have always prided themselves on having open borders.
That's right, Ari. That's a good question, and I think everyone's trying to answer that now. I don't see how Europe is going to, the old Europe countries are reminding these young Europe countries, you've received billions in subsidies over the years to catch you up with us, and now you've got to pony up. You've got to take in. So I don't see how they can do it unless they come up with a coordinated sharing response of this responsibility to house people. But right now they're just trying to deal with the numbers coming in. And I know that the EU is negotiating with Turkey to try to giving Turkey money to keep them there. But Mark, I would ask you, are they going to be allowed to work in Turkey? It's still so hard to see. Merkel is now under attack within her own party because she has accepted so many migrants. So she's faltering. It is so hard to see where this will go, but I don't see how they have to share the burden. Otherwise, Europe will no longer be a community. Walls and fences and border checks will go back up. I don't see any other way.
It's amazing to me that 6 months after this began, there is still no coherent response. They are still saying, wait, what? How do we, we're scrambling. Well, Mark, do you want to answer Eleanor's question?
That the refugee crisis of the summer did not provoke any political talks. It was the Russian intervention at the beginning of October, which was what provoked these talks in Vienna the other day, which is the first purportedly meaningful talks in more than 2 years. So the seriousness of this just doesn't seem to be registering.
Yeah, the war has to be stopped, obviously. That too. I would like to ask Mark
let's talk about solving the underlying problem. These talks in Vienna brought the United States, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia to the table. Really notable that Iran was there and that you have sides that are supporting Assad, like Iran and Russia, as well as sides supporting the moderate rebels, like the US and Saudi Arabia. Russian airstrikes have sort of changed the dynamic. What do you see as the future of this engine that is driving the refugees out of Syria?
I think Iran's participation is the most significant development because they've been kept, largely by the US, been kept at arm's length of anything having to do with this. The last talks in Geneva, they were pointedly told not to show up. So I think that's probably because of the influence Iran has in the region with Hezbollah and others, and of course Assad, but also because the Syrian conflict is, while it is of course its own civil war, it's also part of something much larger. Between Shia Iran and the Arab Gulf states particularly. So I think their participation does open a way ahead. However, who wasn't at those talks in Vienna? Assad regime was not there, nor were any of the rebels. And I find it hard to believe that with the Russians continuing to bomb largely rebel-held positions and not ISIS positions, that how are they going to convince the rebels to come to the table? That's very hard to see right now. And because in response to the Russians, the Qataris and the Emiratis and the Saudis have upped their supplies of weapons to the rebel forces. So it's not calming down at all.
Syria is obviously the largest driver of this global refugee crisis, but it's not the only one. Eleanor, what do you see in Europe as the dynamic between the Syrian refugees and the people who are coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, North Africa, these other crises that are driving people to Europe?
Right, and who've been coming for a long time, actually, Eritrea. And everyone sort of wants to be a Syrian today, all of the refugees, because the Syrians are the golden ones. It's like everyone woke up and realized, oh, we have to help the Syrians, but there's the people coming from Afghanistan is mostly young, accompanied boys. It's tragic. You know they have nothing to go back to. And then Eritrea, it's a horrible dictatorship. Sudan, the wars. So it's like all of a sudden, this situation in Calais, Ari, where we've both been, there have been people there for years. It's swelled from 3,000 to 6,000 now, but finally people are, all of France is waking up to that. And it shows the difficulty of sorting through all of these people. Who can stay, who can't? How do you decide who's an economic refugee and who really needs political asylum? And there's everyone wants a Syrian passport, and it's a huge mess. But the Syrians have really drawn attention to it. It's been going on a long time. And I'll just give you an example. The little boy Aylan Kurti, who was found, of course, in the sand. 70 little children like that have died since then, have drowned. But no one's really paid attention because we haven't seen their picture. But sometimes you need a picture. Everyone understands Syria and what's going on. So this has, in a way, helped the other migrants, but also in a way they're worried. They want to be Syrian.
We've had stories on the air of people landing and ripping up their identity cards if they're not from Syria, so that they can claim to be from Syria because you're eligible for more benefits.
And many of them say they're from Syria, and when people are trying to decide if they get asylum, they'll ask them questions about the culture in Syria. I don't know anything about a red license plates or a popular singer or a TV show, and they've got to answer right. So it's
Mark, what's your level of optimism versus pessimism on the refugee crisis?
I think the war's got quite a while to run yet, and therefore will continue to keep generating refugees.
So pessimism.
Pessimism and fear as to what's going to happen in the lower Balkans. Because now, just a few days ago, Germany and Austria reached an agreement where they would limit the crossing points to 5. And when this stuff starts backing up into Serbia, Croatia, Macedonia, Greece itself, the Turks showed a couple weeks ago when there was a high-level visit to Lesbos that they could interdict and stop. For 2 days, they stopped people coming over. But are they going to be able to interdict and stop people from setting out from Turkey? And that's really the only way to deal with this, is to set up some sort of orderly departure program in Turkey where people can be preliminarily processed, their asylum claims can be preliminarily processed. I mean, as ugly as it is right now with what's happening, people trying to get into Europe, let's imagine what it's going to be like when they start denying thousands and thousands of asylum claims and telling people to go back, which will happen. So, it is a long-term problem. The idea, they are having talks with the Turks now about setting up some sort of camps within Turkey. The Turks, in turn, want to set up camps inside Syria, which is, on every side of it, a bad idea, these so-called safe zones. So and Turkey really is holding the cards right now on this one because it's the main transit point. And as you know, today they're having repeat elections in Turkey, and the ruling party has made the refugees a major point on their platform.
One of the things that struck me covering this debate from the UK and various parts of Europe and Turkey was that you see Europe saying, Turkey, you must do more to stop these people from coming over. And Turkey says, we have 1.5 million Syrians living in our country. We are one not very wealthy country. You are one rich continent, so hush. And then the UK says to Europe, you must stop these people from making their way across into our country. And Europe says, we have 500,000 people. You are one rich country, and you have, 3,000? Hush. And everybody is sort of passing the buck to someone else. Eleanor, the European Union was founded decades ago on this notion of, I don't remember the exact terminology, but it's something like an ever closer union. And you can view the last 30 years with fits and starts as progress in that direction. Has this crisis shredded that document?
Well, it's definitely putting it to the test, Ari. I mean, there are, governments, and François Hollande, the president of France, said the other day, the far right should not use this crisis, migrant crisis, because we've taken in just a modest amount of refugees. So he pretty much said that. Politicians, some are saying we're 500 million people in Europe. We can absorb 1 million refugees. We can find work for them. Many of these people are educated, but then you have these, far right parties that are gaining prominence in many countries. In France, Marine Le Pen, she's talking about the migrants. In Austria, in Switzerland, in Hungary. So it's creating chaos on the political scenes within Europe, and the politicians like Merkel and Hollande who want to do the right thing. It seems they are trying to do the right thing. They've got the far right parties who are gaining prominence, and people are saying we just can't take all these refugees, and it's putting everything to the test, Ari. Everything that Europe was founded on is being tested now, and no one even saw this coming 1 year ago.
Something I'd like to end on, something that listeners on our air have heard, but because we didn't hear it in the initial 6 clips that we played of Eleanor's and my pieces, Mark, what is it like in these refugee camps that are close to the Syrian border? When you visit refugees in Jordan, in Turkey, in Lebanon, are children being educated? Are people able to get medical care? Is life going on as normal? Is everyone in a holding pattern? Is there a sense of desperation or relief that people have escaped the war? What's it like there?
Well, the first thing is the vast majority of Syrians are not in refugee camps. 90% are living in communities in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey among Jordanians and Lebanese. They're not sitting in camps, which on the one hand is probably a little bit more normal. On the other hand, makes it extremely difficult to reach them with services like schools and whatnot. There's an estimated 500,000 Syrian kids outside the country who are not in school and haven't been for 4 years, which gives rise to all the discussion about the lost generation of what are these kids going to do when this war is over? Now you've got kids working on the streets because their parents are not allowed to work and the police are much less apt to pick up a kid. Parents are staying home for the safety of the family unit. Kids are being sent out to work under very exploitative conditions. And I certainly don't want to talk about the lost generation. We don't like to talk about it in terms of national security concerns, but think of it. Hundreds of thousands of children with no education for 4 or 5 years or more. What is that going to do? So it's things, and these are things that people, they want a normal life for their families. If you live in a tent, if you live in a half-finished garage building, your kids can't go to school, you can't afford medical care. The Jordanians, for the first 2 years, they gave free medical care to all Syrians. A year ago, they cut it off because they could no longer afford it. Now Syrians have to pay for medical care. It's all of these things that are combining in the last 6 to 9 months that I think are driving this summer's, the exodus that began this summer, along, of course, with equivocal responses from Europe as to who would be let in. And the frightening thing is there's probably another 10 million Syrians, if this war continues, who may well think about going. And so that's the really alarming part about this, because the countries that are hosting them now have said, we've done our part. Lebanon, 1 in every 4 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee.
Wow.
That means what, 80 million Syrian refugees in America, proportionally? Yeah. It's having a huge impact on these countries.
Well, let's begin to take some of your questions. If you want to come up to the microphone here, we're interested in what you would like to know about. Oh.
When we've had discussions in West Virginia at a recent church group, we're a pretty provincial area and state. But there it came up, the question comes up, and we have a large Syrian and Middle Eastern population, so easily to take in. And yet our governor has committed to bringing in 50 families for the whole state, and that with a lot of criticism. The fear that continues to come up is that most of them are going to be ISIS, and we are importing terrorists. What's the response to that?
The hardest way to get to the United States is as a refugee. The hardest way. The screenings that occur by DHS are the most thorough for refugees than anyone else. John Allen, who's leading the U.S. government's fight against ISIS, has said publicly that he's confident that DHS can handle the security concerns with Syrian refugees. It takes 18 to 24 months for a Syrian, from the date he's accepted for admission to the United States as a refugee, it takes 18 to 24 months for him to be able to travel, and all of that time is spent on security checks.
And medical checks. Many levels of checks.
But it's a fear that is blown far out of proportion. I think the government has a number, and has come under criticism for so many, for the delays that are associated with the checks. But they're well vetted before they get on a plane to come to this country.
And I would add to that, in Vienna, there was a lawyer booth set up to give people advice. And actually, I will say that one of the lawyers in charge said, yes, it could be possible for some extremists to get through like that. He said it is possible. But of course, the overwhelming majority, the Mansour Omar, the man that we have followed, when I met him in Germany, I asked him about being Muslim, and he just shook his head. He said, we are, in that Europeans being afraid of Muslims, more Muslims, he said, we are fleeing that ourselves. We are fleeing those extremists. And he just said, we are just a people, really spoke to Americans. We have faith. Everyone needs a faith, whether it's, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. And he just stressed, we are normal people. We just have a faith. We believe in God, and we are fleeing these extremists too. So I feel that, yes, while it's possible, and probably less possible in the U.S. because of what you're describing, it's, it's not a reason to turn these people away. The vast majority are not.
Yeah, the experience of people coming to the U.S. is very different from people coming to Europe.
Yeah.
People show up in Europe with no vetting, no screening, no process.
Exactly.
And people who come to the U.S. I mean, this is the thing that living overseas really helped me appreciate, is that the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean are huge factors in America's fate and future. And people can't just show up on our shores
That's true.
the way they can in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, you mentioned national security just once, and Ari, you said there's no coherent strategy, and it's a political crisis, but it seems like it's being dealt with everywhere as a refugee crisis, not a national security crisis. And if it was viewed as a national security crisis, wouldn't it become an issue that NATO could deal with? And if you look at the correspondence between the 28 members of NATO and the impacted countries, there's an enormous coherence that can be driven. And within NATO, politicians can upload a problem to an entity that has resources, has the ability to project power, and also has the resources to actually handle issues that occur in camps, like tents, refuge, all of these things. And I'm just wondering, is NATO being used at all? And if it isn't, why not?
I think it's a problem for NATO in the second order. I mean, NATO doesn't involve the Gulf. And the involvement of the Gulf states and other Middle Eastern states in this problem is key. And so, yeah, the NATO membership is contiguous with a lot of the refugee problem right now. It's not contiguous with the political problem that's driving the war in Syria.
That, but it's the catch basin for the fallout from that. And why isn't it being used? Because it's also, to the extent that there's ever going to be a projection of power into the area that's where the problem is, it's the only entity that could provide a coherent response. So I'm just wondering why it isn't being used to spread the pain, so to speak, and also coordinate the response.
The solution is going to entail so many politically unpalatable choices. Everyone will look for someone to blame, and elected officials will get voted out of office because of these politically unpalatable choices. NATO is not strong and powerful enough to say, okay, Hungary, I know you don't want to, but you're going to take X number of people. And Germany, I know you only want to take 500,000, you're going to take 800,000. You know, these are the kinds of choices that have to be made. And I know, Mr. Prime Minister, you would like to build a wall between your country and the other country. We're not going to allow you to. That's not the kind of power NATO has, but those are the kinds of decisions that have to be made.
I would also think that if there was ever thought about introducing NATO forces into this, it's been taken off the table with the introduction of Russian forces. There's no way they're going to get into it with Russia over Syria.
I think maybe the thinking is sometimes limited by the end of what the end game is instead of what the existing game is. And to me, it seems that a international treaty that does exist, that's actually, it overlays the catch basin almost identically. Why it's not implemented to resolve political issues at a strategic level and take the heat off the politicians. I don't understand why, in fact, because all of your responses have been, well, we don't have a NATO response in the problem area. But it just seems you use the organization, if you're smart politically, you use those organizations in ways that in fact weren't foreseen when in fact the threat was much different. But
there's also they're still dealing with the Russians in Ukraine. They can't
Right.
quite even work that one out. So yeah.
NATO isn't exactly looking for new challenges to take on too. Yeah.
Hey guys, I'm Erica. I'm on the NPR Generation Listen board. What I'm really interested in is job creation. So if there's this new people coming to all these different countries, it would seem like an influx of middle-class talent, at least on the Syrian side, would be good for development. I know you guys mentioned the cultural barriers, especially in the newer European countries, but how are some of these countries creating jobs? Are they not creating jobs? Do they not see it as an influx of talent?
I can answer that. Absolutely, it is an influx of talent, and the French government is saying that. And Germany, which has a declining birth rate, so that is absolutely being touted. But on the ground, realistically, it's not going to happen overnight. But of course, I've met very well-educated Syrians who will definitely be working as soon as they learn German and French. It'll just take years. But then you've got these right-wing, factions in every country fighting against that, saying, no, these people are coming to take jobs. And in Europe, the job creation is slower than in America because you cannot get fired and hired as quickly. It's a different ballgame. And then I have to say, realistically, when you're on the ground, when I met, once again, Manzar Omar, because it's somebody we've followed, he went from not knowing how his next meal would come from, but he said to me, we were told Germany had so many factories and jobs. And people will go to a country just on what they've heard. It's no hard, there's data behind that, but he said, and now I realize it's not gonna be so easy to get a job here. Maybe I won't be able to. And so that's the whole point, is to sell these people as the future, and that's what European politicians have to do. But actually making that happen when in France you have 9% unemployment of French people is maybe gonna be difficult.
Do you guys think this is a situation where microfinance might work? Like non-traditional mechanisms? Sure,
everything can work. I think these are probably all being examined. Something's got to be done quickly within the next 5 years. Of course, if they absorb these people in Europe, jobs have to be created. There will be very creative people doing things like this. The startup culture in France is starting to boom. But everything will be needed. But
I'm not an expert on microfinance, but my sense is that it works better in systems where there is not a lot of regulation, where you can set up a shop on a corner and start selling things. That's harder to do in Europe than it is in other parts of the world.
In old Europe, yes.
Thanks.
Mark, you signed up for this work. But Ari, when you went to London, and Eleanor, when you were assigned to Paris, I would imagine that you were going to cover beats that you felt would be radically different than what you're doing now. And so I thank you for stepping in and providing us with this vital coverage. But I'm wondering, how does this impact you when this happens? And how do you keep from becoming emotionally depleted, covering such a tragic and desperate and seemingly insoluble situation?
Well, personally, it's true, you get wrapped up in it. And I remember when I actually took the train from Budapest to Vienna, they had just opened the trains, and I had to do a two-way with Linda Wertheimer for the morning show, and I had to get my bags together, and I was just completely freaking out. Okay, I'll do it from the train station, but I've got to be on that train. And there was just hordes, I don't want to say hordes, that David Cameron used that word. It's not a nice word. But there was just masses of people at the train station, and I remember thinking, oh, I was trying to check out of my hotel. I've got to take a shower. It's just a small thing, but I'm like, what do I have to take a shower for? I mean, and then it just hit me like, these people haven't showered in days or if even weeks. What do I even care? So yes, there was a point after, let's say, a week of doing this, you're exhausted, and the numbers, each person is a person, and you see, my God, but the numbers become so overwhelming. But then, I got to Vienna, and I did get to go to my hotel and have a shower and a meal, and it makes you think more about it. And actually, I have a 9-year-old son in Paris, and I saw all the families, Hungarian families, helping the migrants, coming out to the highway when they started their march down the highway. Hundreds of Hungarians had come out, and they had made sandwiches, and they were giving food and water, and they were blankets, even strollers for babies. It was amazing, and it made me realize I need to maybe personally do something for these people and teach my son how to do this. So it does, it affects you personally, and sometimes it is overwhelming and you just have to get away, but you go back in, and it's really what's happening in Europe. And I realize sometimes in Paris you feel isolated from all this, but it's just a plane ride or a train ride away. And
I think, it's true that we didn't expect this story upon becoming a correspondent in Paris or London, but, we didn't become international correspondents to eat croissants and sip tea. The motivation is to be an important part of a public service of making Americans more informed and bringing compelling, important stories to them about what is happening in the world in places that feel far away, about people who might seem very different, but are in fact much closer and much more like us than we realize. And so when something like this happens, and we have the opportunity to go be part of such an important global event and tell the story to people who otherwise wouldn't know about it, it feels like we're playing an important, valuable role, at least speaking for myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, I realize that the stories can seem unendingly bleak, and so I always try to find details that make them less so. So, for example, when I was in Izmir, Turkey, there was a little cafe where the cafe owner had set up folding tables full of power strips, and he'd posted the Wi-Fi password outside the cafe so Syrians could recharge their cell phones and Skype with their family members back home. And talking to that cafe owner who was doing this small thing in the town of Izmir lent something beyond just desperation and bleakness to the story. And just the experience of meeting people and being there and seeing it for myself and then sharing it with the audience, that's the reason we do this. And it's exhausting, but it's also such a valuable experience. That's, it's not, oh no, we have to go cover this story. It's, oh yes, this is the kind of story that we are here to cover.
yeah, exactly.
From all of your in-country experience in Europe, the EU seems to be facing an existential crisis. Britain, or UK, which faces its own existential crisis with Scotland, seems to be slipping away. They didn't do nearly as well in dealing with the economic troubles as a union, European Union, as did the states, and we're still grappling with it. And they're obviously not coming together as a cohesive, sovereign political force and imposing solutions that would work for the continent, for the Union, on the individual countries. What is your sense of, is the EU going to continue? What's the viability of the EU? Is there much popular support for that, or is it even an important issue? Is everybody's bouncing from crisis to crisis in their own country?
Well, everything you've described is exactly true. But think about it. I look at this a few months ago, we were talking about, is the EU going to survive the Greek debt crisis?
Yeah.
And now no one even talks about it anymore. I mean, personally, I'm not a financier, but Greece is 3% of Europe's economy. I always thought it was overblown. But anyway, I don't know. I mean, it's up to the Europeans, the people who, there's many Europeans who feel European, but yes, there are fringe far-right parties who want to close borders and get out of the euro currency that seem to be eating, nipping at the heels of the politicians who want cohesiveness and togetherness. We'll see what happens. I always say to Europeans who don't feel European, go to America and you'll feel European. And many of them do. I met it. It's true.
Very good.
And you have something to be proud of. You're 500 million strong. You have incredible countries with systems. And many of them do. They come to America. And a Danish person told me once, I realized for the first time that I was a real European in my heart. They have these old cultures and these beautiful architecture, and they have something of value to defend. And it's under a test right now. I don't know where it will go, but I don't see the EU coming apart over this. I think they will find a way to handle it. But
I mean, the UK is going to have a vote on whether to leave the European Union. And everybody predicts that if the UK does leave the EU, then Scotland will vote to leave the UK. David Cameron is confident that the UK will ultimately stay in the EU. These forces have been pulling at the EU since the Union was created, and they may be pulling more strongly now, but you can easily envision a scenario in which the continent breaks apart over this, and you can easily envision a scenario in which they come out on the other side. And that's what makes covering these issues so exciting, is that nobody knows which one it will be.
stay tuned.
Okay, thank you.
So my question is, it's a tiered question, and it also sort of backs up Erica's question about job creation. And my question is about infrastructure, and how are there any plans to expand the ability to take in refugees quickly through housing opportunities or building opportunities, giving refugees the opportunity to build their own housing that will be sustainable for a long period of time, and whether there's a generational difference in views on the refugee situation. For example, is there a difference between the younger community of Europe and the older community of Europe, and what are younger people doing that seems a little bit more progressive, inclusive, or not?
Housing is a huge problem. I was just looking at Sweden, which I visited last January, and they say that people who arrived in Sweden a year ago and could have expected to be resettled in a nice apartment on the outskirts of Stockholm are now being put in converted prison cells or above the Arctic Circle because there's just no more space. Sweden, like Germany, has taken in far more refugees per capita than anyone else. And while I think there are interesting creative ideas here and there about housing, I haven't seen a massive mobilization because, as with everything else about this crisis in Europe, there just does not seem to be a cohesive strategy to address the problems. Do you see a generational divide? Do you think there's a...
I don't, because the people I've seen coming out to help have been of every age. But that's an interesting question that I hadn't even really thought about. So no, I haven't. And this past weekend, the EU voted to have to build housing along spots along the migrant trail. So there's the emergency housing, and then there's the long-term integration. So it's a huge issue. Everything is, like Ari said, just it's emergency at the last minute. It's kind of too late, and
now winter's arriving.
And now
I mean, it was
winter's
one thing when
arriving.
people were sleeping on the side of the road in August. When people are sleeping on the side of the road in December, it's very different. Mark, do you worry that there will be a public health crisis on top of all of these other crises we're talking about?
I think in the Balkans it's very, very possible. Very possible.
Yes.
I just would like your opinion or any thoughts of the situation, which is so minor in comparison of where this country seemed blindsided, and there was very strong negative reactions to the mostly women and with children and unaccompanied minors who were coming from Central America. I'd like to know if any comparisons are being drawn or anyone's talking about this, or if even the public in America, you feel, are suddenly getting insights they didn't have before.
There's an incredible number of unaccompanied children who are making the journey to Europe, especially from Afghanistan. And I think, the common thread is that people are afraid of foreigners crossing the border without an orderly system of protocol. And it doesn't matter whether the numbers are tiny as they are in the UK or massive as they are in Turkey. it scares people. And if people in the UK had spent a little time in Turkey, maybe if people, on the US border had spent a little bit of time in Lebanon, they might have a different perspective.
Yeah.
But there's this universal reaction. Who are these strangers, these foreigners coming into our country? What are they doing here? How can we control this? And I think that's the common thread.
And I listen to NPR and I, of course, read the American press, but I don't know exactly how Americans are feeling about the migrant crisis in Europe. I know there's extreme interest, but I ran into some tourists from the Midwest the other day in Paris, and they said everyone is so negative. They think it's horrible. They just, very negative towards these migrants, and I didn't realize to that extent. But it did cross my mind, all of these women and children, and we've built this fence along our border, and wow, I don't have anything more to say about it than that, because but it does make you look, and a listener wrote to me and said, how can we help? What can we do with these migrants coming into Europe? And I just wrote him back and said, well, I think we have our own migrant issues, and maybe you could help there. So it's a good comparison to make. And I don't know, how are the Americans feeling about the migrants in Europe? Are they sympathetic? Are they horrified? Everyone talks to me also, all those Muslims coming in, oh my gosh. And
to be honest, when that photo of the 3-year-old child was immediately, everywhere around the world, I think Americans started to care about the story in a way that maybe nobody but NPR listeners did before that, because we were covering the story from so many angles for so long before that happened, and suddenly that photo, it really speaks to the power of one compelling image. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thanks very much, everybody, and appreciate your time. And thanks to both of you.